Hello again. I'm Lawrence Holgate, and this is episode 7 of Understanding John Stuart Mill's classic book, Utilitarianism. We're in chapter 3 of my book, Understanding John Stuart Mill. We're going to be talking about his chapter 3 in Utilitarianism, which has the title The Ultimate Sanction. And Mill's point here in the chapter is to talk about motivation. Motivation, that is, for the utilitarian principle. And although the motive of a person has nothing to do with whether that person's conduct is morally right or wrong, it has much to do with the sanctions of a foundational moral principle, and that includes the principle of utility. The question is, what are the motives to obey a principle that says we have to always do the optimific act? How does the utilitarian principle get its binding force, as Mill puts it, on those who adopt the utilitarian principle? What are the sanctions for not promoting the greatest good? In general, Mill is asking the age-old question, why should I be moral? Questions about sanctions arise for any system of morals. All ethical theories must explain why we should feel obliged to do the actions commanded by their foundational principle. For example, Locke must provide us with a motive for obeying the law of nature. Kant must explain why we are obliged to conform our conduct to the categorical imperative. And Mill must show us the sanctions for failing to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number, if and when we have the chance to do that. Now, there's two kinds of sanctions that apply to all ethical theories: external and internal sanctions. Let's begin with external sanctions. Mill means the hope of favor and the fear of displeasure from our fellow creatures or from the ruler of the universe, along with whatever we may have of sympathy or affection for them or of love and awe of him with a capital H, inclining us to do his will independently of selfish consequences. I know that's a mouthful. That's at page 27 of Utilitarianism. If you don't want your friends, family, business associates, or God to dislike you, then your fear of this dislike will serve as a very strong motive for conforming your conduct to any system of morals, including utilitarianism. And if you want their favor, then this will also serve as a motive for obedience. Mill insists that there is no reason why these motives should not attach themselves to the utilitarian morality as completely and as powerfully as to any other. And Mill goes further than this by reminding us that, quote, men do desire happiness, and any moral principle that emphasizes their own happiness and any conduct of others that promotes their happiness will certainly give them a strong inducement, motive, in other words, toward the utilitarian principle. And Mill observes this with regard to the religious motive. He says this is no impediment to utilitarianism. Quote, those who think that conduciveness to the general happiness is the essence or even only the criterion of good must necessarily believe that it is also that which God approves. Page 27 again. In other words, God is a utilitarian. Theists cannot find a better external motive for adopting the utilitarian moralist than that. And my sidebar says this. This reply reverses the divine command theory of ethics, which says that an act is morally obligatory only if it is commanded by the deity, by God, implying that there are no rational constraints on God's commands. Mill says that God only commands acts that are obligatory, and it is conduciveness to the general happiness, not God's commands, that makes them obligatory. Let me repeat that. Only commands acts that are obligatory. God only commands acts that are obligatory. And it is conduciveness to the general happiness, not God's commands, that makes actions obligatory. Let's look now at internal sanctions. As Plato often stressed in Republic and other dialogues, the external motives for moral behavior do not guarantee that people will always do the morally right act or refrain from wrongful conduct. The favor of other The favor of others motivates the bad person to maintain a good reputation, not necessarily to do what is morally right. There are bad people, psychopaths, who know how to game the system. They manage to maintain a good reputation because they know how to lie. They know how to cheat and steal without ever being found out. That's from Plato's Republic, by the way, at 362c, if you want to look up something about Plato. Mill proposes another motive for being moral, a motive that will have a stronger prohibitive effect on a person who contemplates wrongdoing. He suggests that the motive we seek is to be found internally in ourselves, and the name of this is conscience. And here's what Mill says about conscience. It's a feeling in our own mind, a pain more or less intense, attendant on violation of duty, which in properly cultivated moral natures rises in the more serious cases into shrinking from it as an impossibility. That's the power that conscience has. It's painful. It's more or less intense, Mill says. And it comes about when there is a possibility of violating what you believe to be your duty. This is what is lacking in the person who is only taught that being moral is a means of keeping a good reputation in the community. If he does not have a conscience to restrain him, then he will violate a moral duty whenever he can safely get away with this. And there's little or no internal pain he feels when contemplating a future wrongful deed. Conscience is a prospective moral feeling. That is, it is what we feel before we violate a rule of right conduct. Remorse and guilt, for example, are retrospective. They are feelings we encounter after the violation. So think about that. Conscience happens before we do something bad or evil or wrong. Remorse and guilt are the feelings, the moral feelings we have after we've done something we believe to have been morally wrong. Mill refers to conscience as the ultimate sanction of all morality. Hence, the feeling of conscience is the sanction of the utilitarian moral standard. He says, there being no reason why this feeling may not be cultivated to as great intensity in connection with the utilitarian as with any other rule of morals. Let's go back to Plato. I'm going to compare these guys again. Plato doesn't refer to conscience or remorse as ultimate sanctions in his dialogues, although his discussion of the just soul shows that it might serve the same purpose. A person has a just soul when each part of the soul, meaning appetite, emotion, or reason, is doing the work it is naturally suited to do, with the element of reason having supremacy. And this is the healthiest condition of the soul, Plato says, and it is argued the person who cultivates this condition would never commit immoral acts, such as betrayal of a friend, untrustworthiness, temple robbery, adultery, disrespecting parents, neglecting the gods. Those are all the things that's the list that Plato has of immoral acts. So what I want you to think about here is he talking about an internal feeling? Does Plato have a concept of conscience or a concept of remorse as ultimate sanctions in his dialogues when he talks about the healthiest condition of the soul? Is he talking about the same thing that Mill is talking about? A great example for you if you want to pursue a term paper. Let's go to conscience and the feelings of mankind. I'm reading from section 3.2 of my book. It is possible, let me start again. It's a question I'm asking, not a statement. Is it possible for feelings of conscience and remorse to attach themselves to the utilitarian principle? We've just talked about conscience. We've talked about remorse and guilt. Is it possible for these feelings to attach themselves to the principle of utility? Perhaps we should first ask, what kind of question is this? Is it a scientific question? Maybe a psychological question? Answered empirically with reference to observation and experience? Or is this a philosophical question? Answered analytically with reference to relevant concepts and their interrelationships? So what are we asking here? When we ask what kind of question is the question I just gave you, is it possible for feelings of conscience and remorse to attach themselves to the utilitarian principle, are we just doing psychology here? Or are we actually doing philosophy? I'm thinking of psychology now as a science. Perhaps the best way is to answer this is to look at Mill's methodology. Here is his argument for the conclusion that conscientious feelings can and do serve as a sanction for the utilitarian standard. I'm going to be reading now at a long series of steps. It looks to me, as I look at the book, there are two different kinds of premises that he's talking, three premises that he's going to talk about, and each of them is going to need some feeling, some steel. Each of them is going to need some explanation here as we go through these. So I'm going to try to halt. I mean, I've been halting myself. Please forgive me. Let's start with the first step in the argument that Mill has. The first premise is that conscientious feelings, that is conscience, can firmly attach to the utilitarian standard, but only if there is a natural sentiment for the utilitarian morality. Well, what is that? Step 2. There is a natural sentiment for the utilitarian morality, namely, it's the social feelings of mankind. And those social feelings he defines as the desire to be in unity with our fellow creatures. Therefore, conscientious feelings can firmly attach to the utilitarian standard. Now, the argument is deductive. And it is valid. That is, if we accept the premises that I just read to you, then the conclusion must be true. But are the premises true? In premises 1 and 2, the term natural sentiment is a concept that was often used in the 19th century to express the view that morality is based on a sentiment or feeling that is part of our natural makeup. Now, this doesn't mean that the feeling is innate, nor does it mean that everyone has these feelings. Mill believes that it is acquired in the same way that speaking and reasoning are acquired. And like speaking and reasoning, children can develop it to a high degree by careful parental attention and cultivation. Others will develop it to a lesser degree, and still others don't develop it at all. The psychopath. In the second premise, which reads, there is a natural sentiment for the utilitarian morality, Mill says that natural sentiment is the social feelings of mankind, the desire to be in unity with our fellow creatures. And that's reminiscent of Plato's student Aristotle, who famously wrote this in the Politics at section in Politics 2, 1, 2, 3, 1253a. Here's the quote from Aristotle. Man is by nature a social animal. There's a famous quote right there. Let us read it again. Man is by nature a social animal, an individual who is unsocial naturally and not accidentally is either beneath our notice or more than human. Society is something that precedes the individual. Anyone who either cannot lead the common life or is so self-sufficient as not to need to, and therefore does not partake of society, is either a beast or a god. So what are you, a beast or a god, or are you man or woman? Remember, man is by nature a social animal. That's the observation of Aristotle. And Mill goes somewhat farther than Aristotle by writing not just that humans are social, but that they have social feelings, the desire to be in unity with our fellow creatures. Mill agrees with Aristotle that humans are beings who naturally partake of society. He adds to this observation that after a relatively short period, humans will begin to have a temporary feeling that the interests of others are in fact their own interests. That feeling, with proper cultivation, soon becomes permanent. And here's a long quote from Mill, and I think I'll read the quote and then we'll stop for the evening. Here's what he says at page 31 of Utilitarianism. Not only does all strengthening of social ties and all healthy growth of society give to each individual a stronger personal interest in practically consulting the welfare of others, it also leads him to identify his feelings more and more with their good, or at least with an even greater degree of practical consideration for it. He comes as though instinctively to be conscious of himself, as a being who, of course, pays regard to others. The good of others becomes to him a thing naturally and necessarily to be attended to, like any of the physical conditions of our existence. End quote. It sounds almost like he's trying to get some idea of the concept of empathy. He doesn't use the word empathy, but he is talking about that, isn't he? Now, this is clearly an empirical claim about human nature. However, social psychologists in the 20th century cite obvious counterexamples that falsify the idea that humans are naturally oriented toward each other in the way suggested by Aristotle and Mill. And here's one recent contrary voice. We engage in acts of loyalty, moral concern, and cooperation primarily toward our inner circles, not to all mankind, but just those people who we know best. But we do this at the expense of people outside of those circles. I'll read that sentence again. We engage in acts of loyalty, moral concern, and cooperation primarily toward our inner circles, but we do so at the expense of people outside of those circles. Our altruism is not unbounded, it is parochial. In support of this phenomenon, the hormone oxytocin, long considered to play a key role in forming social bonds, has been shown to facilitate affiliation toward one's in-group, but can increase defensive aggression towards one's out-group. Other research suggests that this self-sacrificial intragroup love co-evolved with intergroup war, and that societies who most value loyalty to each other tend to be those most likely to endorse violence toward outgroups. So that's a concept of social psychology. So it looks like Mill and Aristotle have really got themselves into a battle of social psychology, not of philosophy at all. And by extension, social psychologists would also agree with Mill that the desire to be in unity with our fellow creatures is something we naturally feel toward all humans, no matter what we know about their race, ethnicity, social class, or religion. Now, in fairness to Mill, he does point out that our moral feelings are susceptible of being cultivated in almost any direction. So if they are cultivated to favor one's in-group, it is still the case that people in these groups will have social feelings for one another, even if they are weaker or non-existent for those who are in out-groups. I'm going to stop there. I told you 3 paragraphs ago that I would stop then after I read that quote from Mill, and I went right on. Excuse me. It was good to have you listen to me again, and we'll do this again next Monday. In the meantime, let's see, we're one day from voting in the election. We're having elections for those of you in the United States. We're having midterm elections, as they call it, We're voting for members of Congress, and we're voting for members of the Senate. If you haven't got out there to vote, please do so. I think this is an important election, very important election for some people. I'm not going to take any sides right now. I don't think that would be fair to anyone. I just want you to vote, okay? So we'll see you next Monday. Maybe we can talk a bit then about the elections. So we're finished now. I'm reading and finishing at page 59 of my book, Understanding John Stuart Mill. And we are, for those of you who only are looking at the digital book, it's section 3.2. If you want to get a copy of the book, go to my website, holgatebooks.com. My name is spelled Houlgate, holgatebooks.com. The first thing you will see is an offer to give you a free copy, a PDF copy of my book, Understanding Philosophy, in which I explain what philosophy is and how you can read and write philosophy better than you might now be doing, or well, you may not be doing it at all. You get a free copy by subscribing to the website. By subscribing to the website, I only mean that I'm going to send you a newsletter 4 times a year. And then you can take a look at, and from there, you can click on the image of Understanding John Stuart Mill, the image of that book cover. That will take you to Amazon.com, where I sell all of my books. And if you're not a member of Amazon, you can sign up to be a member of Amazon at that point and purchase the book itself, either the digital copy or the personal copy. And I promised you I would leave. Good day. Thank you.